His hands trembled as he applied the final touches of makeup to age his face, adding wrinkles and weathered skin that told stories of hardship. The transformation was complete. Marcus Chen, the tech mogul who graced Forbes covers, had vanished. In his place stood Mike, just another invisible worker society overlooked every single day. This wasn't about a social experiment or content for his company's blog. This was personal. This was about finding the woman who gave him up 37 years ago. The woman who lived somewhere in these very streets, completely unaware that her son had become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Marcus as he stepped out of the cheap motel room he'd rented under a false name. His luxury penthouse downtown sat empty, his assistant sworn to secrecy about his whereabouts for the next 4 weeks. The garbage truck rumbled in the distance, its engine breaking the morning silence like a wake-up call to reality. Marcus had spent 3 weeks training for this role, learning the routes, understanding the job, and memorizing every detail that would make his disguise believable. He'd watched documentaries, interviewed sanitation workers, and studied their movements until he could replicate them perfectly. But no amount of preparation could settle the nervous energy coursing through his veins right now. This neighborhood held fragments of his earliest memories, though most had faded like old photographs left too long in the sun. Somewhere in these streets lived the woman whose face he'd only seen in one faded photograph, his birth mother. The woman who'd left him at a fire station wrapped in a blanket with a note that simply said, "Please give him a better life than I can." The crew leader, a gruff man named Tony, barely glanced at Marcus when he arrived at the depot. New workers came and went so frequently that another face hardly registered as noteworthy in his world. Marcus kept his head down, mimicking the exhausted posture of someone who'd worked manual labor their entire life. His hands, usually soft from boardroom meetings and business dinners, were now covered with cheap work gloves hiding his pampered skin. The other workers gathered around the truck, sharing coffee and cigarettes in the cold morning air. Their conversations floated around Marcus like background noise. Complaints about bills, sick kids, broken cars, and dreams deferred. These were real problems, the kind Marcus had forgotten existed since his company's IPO made him wealthy beyond imagination. He felt a pang of guilt, remembering how disconnected he'd become from everyday struggles that millions faced. But he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on his mission, finding her, understanding why, getting answers to questions that had haunted him since he was old enough to understand what adoption meant. The truck rolled into Maple Street just as the sun began painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Marcus's heart rate quickened as he recognized landmarks from his fragmented childhood memories. The old corner store, now boarded up, the playground where he'd scraped his knee at 5 years old. Every house they passed could be hers. Every window could frame the face he'd been searching for his entire life. Tony barked instructions, assigning Marcus to one side of the street while he took the other. The routine was simple. Grab the bins, empty them into the truck, return them to the curb. Repeat, hour after hour, block after block. Marcus's muscles, despite his gym membership and personal trainer, screamed in protest within the first 30 minutes. But he pushed through the pain, maintaining his disguise even when every fiber of his being wanted to stop. This wasn't about comfort. This was about truth, about closure, about understanding the woman who made the hardest decision of her life and changed the trajectory of his forever. She appeared so suddenly that Marcus nearly dropped the garbage bin he was holding. An elderly woman emerged from house number 47, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a faded floral dress that had seen better days. Something about her face made his breath catch in his throat. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw. Features that seemed hauntingly familiar when he looked in the mirror. Could this be her? His hands shook as he returned the empty bin to her curb, trying to appear casual while his mind raced with possibilities. The woman didn't even glance his way, treating him with the same invisibility that society granted to all service workers. She shuffled to her mailbox, retrieved a handful of envelopes, and disappeared back inside without a word. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, garbage truck rumbling impatiently behind him. Tony shouted something about keeping pace, but the words barely registered. Everything he'd planned, every scenario he'd rehearsed in his mind, evaporated in that single moment. What if she was the one? What would he even say? The rest of the day passed in a blur of garbage bins and aching muscles, but Marcus's mind remained fixed on house number 47. During lunch break, he casually asked Tony about the residence on Maple Street, trying to sound like a curious newcomer, making small talk. Tony shrugged and mentioned that 47 belonged to old Mrs. Patterson, a widow who'd lived there for 40 years and kept mostly to herself. The name meant nothing to Marcus. His adoption records had been sealed, his birth mother's identity hidden behind legal walls he'd spent millions trying to breach. But DNA didn't lie, and something in his gut screamed that this woman was connected to him somehow. He needed more information, needed to be certain before he revealed himself and potentially destroyed both their lives with the truth. The private investigator he'd hired had narrowed the search to this neighborhood, this street, but had hit a dead end with specific identification. That's why Marcus had taken matters into his own hands, becoming invisible to get close to a truth that money alone couldn't buy. Tomorrow he'd return. Tomorrow he'd find a way to interact with her. Tomorrow he'd begin unraveling the mystery that had defined his entire existence. As the garbage truck pulled away from Maple Street that evening, Marcus glanced back at house number 47 one final time. Warm light glowed from the windows, and he could see the silhouette of Mrs. Patterson moving through her kitchen, probably preparing dinner for one. The image struck him with unexpected emotion. Loneliness he recognized all too well, despite his wealth and success. His adoptive parents had been wonderful, loving people who'd given him every advantage, but they'd passed away 5 years ago in a car accident. Since then, the emptiness of not knowing where he came from had grown into an obsession he couldn't ignore. Money could buy comfort, security, and power, but it couldn't fill the void of not knowing your biological roots. It couldn't answer the questions that woke him at 3 in the morning. Did she think about him? Did she regret her decision? Did she wonder if he was alive, happy, successful? As Marcus returned to his motel room that night, every muscle screaming in protest, he knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever truth he uncovered, would be worth every moment of this elaborate charade. The game had begun, and there was no turning back now. Morning arrived with the same brutal alarm at 4:30, and Marcus's body protested every movement as he dragged himself from bed. His personal trainer had prepared him for physical challenges, but nothing compared to the reality of manual labor day after day. Blisters had formed on his palms despite the gloves, and muscles he didn't know existed screamed with every step. But as he looked at himself in the mirror, applying the aging makeup once again, he felt more alive than he had in years. The corporate world had made him wealthy but numb, surrounding himself with people who wanted something from him, relationships built on transactions rather than genuine connection. Here, disguised as Mike the garbage collector, nobody wanted anything from him, because nobody saw him at all. It was liberating in a way he hadn't expected. As he headed to the depot for day 2, Marcus caught himself actually looking forward to returning to Maple Street, to house number 47, to the woman who might hold all the answers he'd been desperately seeking his entire life. The truck arrived at Maple Street earlier than the previous day, and Marcus volunteered to take the route that included house 47 before Tony could assign it elsewhere. His heart pounded as he approached her property, the early morning fog giving everything a dreamlike quality that made the moment feel surreal. The garbage bin sat at the curb as expected, and Marcus worked methodically, his eyes constantly darting to the windows, hoping for another glimpse of Mrs. Patterson. Then, like a gift from the universe, the front door opened. She emerged wearing the same faded floral dress, carrying a small bag of additional trash she'd apparently forgotten to put out the night before. This was his chance. Marcus took a deep breath and moved toward her with the empty bin, timing his approach to intersect with her path. Their eyes met for the first time, and the world seemed to stop spinning for just a moment. "Oh, I'm sorry, I almost forgot this bag," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice soft and slightly apologetic as she held out the small trash bag. Marcus took it from her, their fingers nearly touching in the exchange, and he searched her face for any sign of recognition. But there was nothing, just the polite acknowledgement one gives to service workers before forgetting them entirely. Up close, he could see the lines that decades of life had etched into her face, the tiredness in her eyes that spoke of struggles and sorrows. She was probably in her mid-60s, which would make the timeline work if she'd given birth to him as a young woman. His throat tightened with emotion, but he forced himself to respond in the gruff voice he'd been practicing. "No problem, Mom. Happy to help." She offered a small smile, the kind reserved for strangers being polite, and turned to walk back inside. Marcus stood frozen, the small trash bag clutched in his hand like it was made of gold. That voice. Something about her voice echoed in the deepest corners of his memory, in places he couldn't consciously access, but his soul somehow recognized. For the rest of that day, Marcus replayed the interaction over and over in his mind, like a detective examining evidence. The way she'd smiled, the warmth in her voice despite clearly struggling financially based on her appearance and home condition. Tony noticed his distraction and barked at him twice for missing bins, threatening to report him if his performance didn't improve. Marcus apologized and refocused, but every fiber of his being wanted to abandon the truck, run back to House 47, and demand answers. Instead, he maintained his cover, playing the role of an exhausted worker, just trying to make it through another day. During lunch, he pulled out his phone and texted his private investigator with new information. Mrs. Patterson, House 47 Maple Street, approximately 65 years old, widow, lived there 40 years. The investigator responded within minutes, promising to dig deeper into her background, cross-referencing with the limited information from Marcus's sealed adoption records. The wait would be excruciating, but Marcus had learned patience, building his empire from nothing. Good things came to those who played the long game strategically and carefully. On day 3, Marcus arrived at Maple Street with a plan. He'd noticed Mrs. Patterson's garbage bins were old and damaged, one of them cracked along the side where it had probably been dropped too many times. During his lunch break, he'd gone to a hardware store and purchased a sturdy new bin using cash, careful to leave no paper trail connecting his real identity to this neighborhood. Tony had gone to grab food, leaving Marcus alone with the truck for 20 precious minutes. He quickly swapped out Mrs. Patterson's broken bin with the new one, his heart racing at this small act of kindness that felt monumental. When she discovered it, would she wonder who'd done it? Would she ask questions? Marcus knew he was taking a risk, drawing attention to himself when invisibility was his best cover. But something compelled him to help her, this woman who might be his biological mother, struggling alone in a house that clearly needed repairs she couldn't afford. As he placed the new bin carefully at her curb, he noticed peeling paint on her porch, a broken step, gutters hanging loose. His billionaire instincts immediately calculated repair costs, maybe 20,000 to fix everything properly. For him, pocket change. For her, probably an impossible fortune. The next morning, Marcus watched from across the street as Mrs. Patterson discovered the new garbage bin. She stood on her porch with her morning coffee, staring at it with confusion written across her face. She walked down to examine it closely, running her hand over the smooth plastic, comparing it to her old damaged one that Marcus had discreetly left beside it. Her expression shifted from confusion to something else, surprise, maybe even emotion. She looked up and down the street as if searching for whoever had performed this anonymous act of kindness. Marcus quickly turned away, pretending to struggle with a particularly heavy bin, but he watched from his peripheral vision as she stood there for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She brought both hands to her face, and her shoulders shook slightly. Was she crying? The sight hit Marcus like a physical blow. Such a small gesture, a $40 garbage bin, had moved her to tears. What kind of life had she lived where something so simple meant so much? His wealth suddenly felt obscene, wasteful, meaningless compared to the simple human need for kindness and recognition. Later that day, as Marcus emptied the new bin he'd given her, he found an envelope taped to the lid. His name, or rather his fake name, was written on it in shaky handwriting. To the kind garbage collector. His hands trembled as he opened it, looking around to make sure Tony wasn't watching. Inside was a handwritten note on floral stationery that looked decades old, the kind people saved for special occasions. The message was simple but profound. Thank you for the new bin. I can't remember the last time someone did something kind for me, without wanting anything in return. You have no idea what it means to be seen, truly seen, when the world has trained itself to look right through you. God bless you for your generous heart. You restored my faith that good people still exist in this world. With deep gratitude, Margaret Patterson. Marcus read the note 3 times, his vision blurring with unexpected tears. Margaret. Her name was Margaret, and her words about being invisible, about being overlooked. She understood exactly what he'd been experiencing these past few days. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here they were, potentially mother and son, both feeling unseen by the world for entirely different reasons. Marcus folded Margaret's note carefully and placed it in his pocket, a treasure more valuable than any contract he'd ever signed worth millions. The words haunted him throughout the day as he moved from house to house, bin after bin, street after street. She understood invisibility in ways his wealth had shielded him from until now. As a billionaire, everyone saw him, or rather, they saw his money, his power, his influence. As Mike, the garbage collector, he'd discovered a strange freedom in being overlooked, but Margaret's note reminded him of the painful side of that invisibility. For people like her, being unseen wasn't a temporary disguise or social experiment. It was daily reality, a slow erasure of humanity that happened one ignored greeting at a time. That evening, back in his motel room, Marcus pulled out the single photograph he had of his birth mother. It was grainy, taken from a distance 37 years ago by a social worker, showing a young woman with dark hair walking away from the fire station where she'd left him. He held it next to a photo he'd secretly taken of Margaret that morning. The age difference made comparison difficult, but something in the bone structure, the way they both held their shoulders, seemed to match. Or was he seeing what he desperately wanted to see? His private investigator called at 9 p.m. with preliminary results. Margaret Patterson, born Margaret Rose Sullivan, was indeed 64 years old. She'd moved to Maple Street 40 years ago with her husband David, who died 15 years ago from cancer, leaving her with medical debt she was still paying off. No children listed in any records, no biological connections flagged in the database searches. But then the investigator mentioned something interesting. There was a 7-month gap in Margaret's work history when she was 27, right around the time Marcus would have been born. She'd worked at a diner consistently for 3 years, then suddenly disappeared from all records for 7 months, then reappeared, working at a different diner across town. Marcus's pulse quickened. Pregnancy. She could have hidden a pregnancy, given birth, surrendered the baby, and started over somewhere new where nobody knew her secret. It was exactly the kind of gap that meant everything or nothing depending on how you interpreted it. The investigator promised to dig deeper, to find medical records or witnesses from that time period. But Marcus knew that after 37 years, evidence might be impossible to find. The only way to know for certain would be a DNA test, and that required getting close enough to Margaret to obtain a sample without raising suspicion about his true identity. The following week fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Every morning, Marcus arrived at Maple Street and exchanged small pleasantries with Margaret, who'd begun waiting on her porch when she heard the garbage truck approaching. Their conversations were brief, comments about the weather, observations about the neighborhood, simple human interactions that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. She started bringing him coffee on Thursday morning, a thermos of hot black coffee that she insisted he take because you workers start so early and deserve something warm. Marcus accepted it with genuine gratitude, the gesture touching him more deeply than she could possibly understand. Here was a woman who clearly had very little, sharing what she had with someone she perceived as having even less. It was generosity in its purest form, untainted by expectation of return or recognition. As he drank her coffee that morning, Marcus made a decision. Whatever the DNA test eventually revealed, whether Margaret was his biological mother or not, he was going to help her. Not with a dramatic reveal of his wealth, but quietly, carefully, in ways that would actually improve her life without overwhelming her with charity she might refuse out of pride. On Friday, Marcus noticed Margaret struggling with her lawn. The grass had grown wild, and she was attempting to push an ancient manual mower that clearly wasn't cutting anything effectively. He watched her struggle for nearly 5 minutes before Tony barked at him to keep moving, but the image stayed with him all day. That evening, Marcus did something risky. He returned to Maple Street after his shift ended, still in his garbage collector disguise, carrying a modern electric mower he'd purchased from a pawn shop so it wouldn't look suspiciously new. He knocked on Margaret's door just as the sun was setting, his heart hammering so hard he worried she might hear it. She opened the door with surprise and confusion written across her face, clearly not expecting visitors, especially not the garbage man at 6 p.m. Marcus cleared his throat and launched into the explanation he'd rehearsed. "Mum, I noticed your mower's not working so good. I've got this extra one I'm not using, and I thought maybe you could use it. My landlord got a new one, said I could have the old one, but I live in an apartment with no yard." The lie came easier than he expected, though guilt twisted in his stomach. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus feared he'd overstepped, broken the invisible boundary between service worker and homeowner. But then her eyes filled with tears again, and she invited him inside. Stepping into Margaret's home felt like walking into a time capsule and a confessional booth simultaneously. The interior was clean but worn, filled with furniture from decades past that had been maintained with obvious care despite its age. Photographs covered every available surface. Margaret and a man who must have been her late husband David, frozen in happier times. Vacation photos, anniversary celebrations, a lifetime of memories preserved in fading images. But Marcus noticed something crucial. No baby pictures, no children, no evidence of the family life most people accumulated over decades. The absence spoke volumes, confirming what records had suggested. Margaret offered him iced tea, which he accepted, and they sat in her small kitchen talking for 30 minutes about nothing important. The neighborhood changes, memories of how Maple Street used to be, small stories that created the illusion of normalcy. But Marcus's eyes kept wandering to a small photo on the refrigerator, partially hidden behind a calendar. It showed a much younger Margaret, maybe in her 20s, sitting alone on a park bench, looking directly at the camera, with an expression of profound sadness. Something about that photo felt significant, like a clue hidden in plain sight. He wanted to ask about it, but couldn't find a natural way to bring it up without seeming invasive or strange. As Marcus prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door and did something completely unexpected. She hugged him, not a brief, polite hug, but a real embrace that lasted several seconds, the kind you give family members you haven't seen in years. "You're a good man, Mike," she said softly, using his fake name with such genuine warmth it made him ache with guilt about the deception. "In all the years I've lived on this street, you're the first person who's treated me like I matter. Most people look right through me like I'm invisible, like I'm just part of the scenery they pass by every day. But you see me. You really see me. That means more than you could possibly understand." Marcus struggled to respond, emotion choking his words. If only she knew the truth, that he wasn't just any good man, but possibly her son, the baby she'd given up 37 years ago, now standing in her doorway, worth $3 billion. The irony and tragedy of the moment overwhelmed him. He mumbled something about it being no trouble and fled to his car before she could see the tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. As he drove back to his motel, Marcus realized something profound. He was no longer sure if he wanted confirmation that she was his mother, because that confirmation would necessitate revealing the truth, and the truth might destroy the simple, beautiful connection they were building. That night, Marcus sat in his motel room staring at the business card for a DNA testing service the private investigator had recommended. Getting a sample from Margaret would be easy now. She'd served him coffee in a mug. He'd used a glass for iced tea in her home. He could have taken either one, sent them to the lab, and had definitive answers within a week. But his hand hesitated over his phone, unable to make the call that would set that process in motion. What if she was his mother? What if she wasn't? Both answers came with complications that terrified him in different ways. If Margaret was his biological mother, he'd have to decide whether to reveal his true identity, and that revelation could shatter the genuine relationship they were carefully building. She might feel manipulated, deceived, hurt that he'd gone to such elaborate lengths to investigate her instead of simply approaching honestly. Or worse, she might embrace him, not as Mike the kind garbage man, but as Marcus the billionaire. And he'd never know if her love was real or corrupted by the knowledge of his wealth. But if she wasn't his mother, then he'd have to accept that his birth mother might be forever lost to him. And this connection he'd formed with Margaret, as meaningful as it felt, was built on false pretenses he'd eventually have to confess or abandon. Either path led to pain. Either choice meant risk. Marcus set down the business card and decided to wait. At least for now, he could enjoy the simple gift of being seen for who he truly was inside, even if everything else about him was a carefully constructed lie. The weekend felt impossibly long without the routine of Maple Street. Marcus spent Saturday pacing his motel room, checking his phone obsessively for updates from his investigator, though he'd told the man to hold off on further digging. His assistant called twice, asking when he'd return to the office, reminding him of board meetings and investor calls he was missing. Marcus made excuses, claiming he needed more time for personal matters, knowing his sudden disappearance was creating chaos in his company. But for the first time in his adult life, business didn't feel like the most important thing in his world. The empire he'd built, the billions he'd accumulated, the respect he commanded in boardrooms across the globe, none of it compared to the simple warmth of Margaret's kitchen and the feeling of being truly seen by another human being. On Sunday, he drove past her house 3 times like a teenager with a crush, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop himself. Each time he saw her through the window, going about her simple Sunday routine, something in his chest tightened. She was alone, always alone. And he understood that loneliness on a level that transcended blood relation, that connected them through the universal human need for meaningful connection in a world that increasingly isolated people behind screens and superficial interactions. Monday morning arrived with unexpected rain, and Marcus worried the weather might prevent their usual interaction. But as the garbage truck pulled onto Maple Street, he saw Margaret standing on her covered porch with 2 thermoses of coffee instead of 1. She waved when she spotted him, and despite Tony's presence and the need to maintain his cover, Marcus couldn't stop the genuine smile that spread across his face. He took his time with her bins, and when he finished, she came down the porch steps despite the rain, holding an umbrella and both thermoses. "I thought you might need extra warmth on a day like this," she said, handing him both containers. "One is regular coffee, the other is hot chocolate. I wasn't sure which you'd prefer." Marcus accepted them with gratitude that went beyond words, and they stood in the rain for a moment just looking at each other. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of loneliness meeting loneliness, need meeting need. "You should come for dinner sometime," Margaret said suddenly, the words tumbling out like she'd been working up courage to say them. "I mean, if you'd like. I know it's probably strange, me inviting the garbage man to dinner, but I don't care what people think anymore. You've been kinder to me than anyone in years, and I'd like to repay that kindness with a home-cooked meal." Marcus knew accepting the invitation was dangerous, that it would deepen their connection and make the eventual truth even more complicated. But he heard himself saying yes before his rational mind could stop him. They agreed on Wednesday evening, giving Margaret time to prepare and Marcus time to panic about what he was doing. As the truck pulled away, Tony gave him a strange look and asked if he was getting friendly with the old lady on Maple Street. Marcus shrugged it off, saying she was just being nice, but he could tell Tony was suspicious. The last thing he needed was workplace gossip about Mike the garbage man befriending elderly women in the neighborhood. That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He called his therapist, the one he'd seen after his adoptive parents died, the one who'd helped him process the grief and abandonment issues he'd carried his entire life. He explained the situation, leaving out identifying details, and asked for advice. The therapist listened quietly and then asked a simple question that cut through all of Marcus's rationalizations. "Are you doing this for her or for yourself?" Marcus couldn't answer because the truth was he didn't know anymore. What had started as a mission to find his birth mother had transformed into something else entirely, something more human and vulnerable than he'd anticipated. Wednesday arrived with the weight of significance that changed ordinary days into turning points. Marcus finished his shift early, claiming stomach issues to Tony, then went back to his motel to shower and change. He couldn't show up in his garbage collector uniform. That would seem strange for an evening dinner, but he also couldn't dress too nicely or risk breaking his working-class cover. He settled on clean jeans and a simple button-down shirt, the kind a sanitation worker might own for church or family gatherings. He stopped at a small grocery store and bought flowers, a simple bouquet of daisies that cost $12, the kind of gift Mike could afford on his salary. As he drove to Maple Street, Marcus's hands shook on the steering wheel. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, had given presentations to thousands without nervousness. But the thought of sitting across a dinner table from Margaret made him feel like a scared child. At exactly 6 p.m., he knocked on her door, bouquet in hand, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than he had in decades. Margaret opened the door wearing a nice dress, clearly having made an effort for the occasion, and her face lit up when she saw the flowers. "Oh, Mike, they're beautiful. You didn't have to do that." But her smile said she was deeply touched by the gesture. The dinner was simple but delicious. Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the kind of comfort food that spoke of home and tradition. Margaret apologized for it not being fancy, but Marcus assured her it was perfect, and he meant it. They ate at her small kitchen table, and conversation flowed easier than expected. She told him about her life with David, how they'd met at the diner where she worked, how he'd courted her with terrible jokes and persistent charm until she finally agreed to a date. She spoke about his illness, The years of watching him fade, the loneliness that settled in after he died like fog that never quite lifted. Marcus listened, really listened, in a way he rarely did in his regular life where conversations were transactions and time was money. Then Margaret asked about his life, and Marcus had to navigate carefully through the lies he'd constructed. He talked about being adopted, which was true, about losing his adoptive parents, which was true, about feeling disconnected from the world, which was absolutely true. But he invented a working-class background, a modest life that bore no resemblance to his actual reality of penthouses and private jets. The lies tasted bitter, but he justified them as temporary, as necessary for reaching a truth that mattered more than factual accuracy. After dinner, they moved to the living room, and Margaret served coffee with homemade apple pie. As they talked, Marcus noticed her glancing repeatedly at an old photo album on the bookshelf, the kind with a leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Finally, she reached for it, handling it with the reverence people reserve for sacred objects. "Can I show you something?" she asked, her voice suddenly fragile. Marcus nodded, his heart rate accelerating. She opened the album to a page near the middle, and there was the photo. A younger Margaret, probably 27, visibly pregnant, standing alone in what looked like a small apartment. No celebration, no joy, just a woman documenting a moment with the sadness of someone saying goodbye. "I've never told anyone this story," Margaret whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "My husband knew, but we never spoke of it after we got married. It was my secret shame, my private grief that I carried alone for 37 years. Marcus couldn't breathe. 37 years, his exact age. His hands trembled as Margaret continued, the words pouring out like a confession she'd held back for too long. "I had a baby when I was young and scared and alone, a boy. I gave him up because I thought I was giving him a chance at a better life than I could provide." The room spun around Marcus as Margaret spoke, her words confirming what his heart had known from the first moment he saw her face. She described the pregnancy, the shame she'd felt in a conservative small town, the way people had judged and whispered. She'd moved to the city, hidden herself away, given birth alone in a charity hospital. She'd held her baby boy for exactly 10 minutes before the social worker took him away. She'd wrapped him in a blue blanket. Marcus remembered that blanket from his adoption file, had seen it in photos. She'd written a note asking whoever found him to give him a better life. Then she'd walked out of that hospital and tried to forget. But you can't forget a child you carried for 9 months, can't forget the weight of him in your arms, or the sound of his cry, or the way his tiny fingers gripped yours. "I've thought about him every single day for 37 years, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now. "I've wondered if he's alive, if he's happy, if he hates me for abandoning him. I've prayed that whoever raised him loved him better than I could have. And I've carried the guilt of giving away the only child I'd ever have. Because after that, David and I tried for years, but I could never get pregnant again, like it was punishment for what I'd done." Marcus sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at this woman who was his mother, who had just poured her heart out to who she thought was a kind garbage collector, not knowing she was confessing to the very son she'd mourned for nearly 4 decades. Marcus felt like he was drowning in air, his lungs working but no oxygen reaching his brain. Every word Margaret spoke was a piece of the puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire life, but hearing it now, in this moment, felt like being crushed under the weight of truth he desperately sought. He wanted to reach across the space between them and tell her everything, that her son was alive and successful beyond imagination, that he'd never stopped wondering about her either, that he didn't hate her, could never hate her. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind the lies of his disguise and the paralyzing fear of what would happen when she learned the truth. Instead, He did the only thing his body would allow. He reached out and took her hand. Margaret looked up with surprise, tears still streaming down her face, and Marcus squeezed gently. "I don't think you abandoned him," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "I think you loved him enough to give him a chance you couldn't give yourself. That's not abandonment. That's the most selfless kind of love that exists." Margaret broke down completely then, sobbing in a way that spoke of decades of grief finally being acknowledged, and Marcus moved to sit beside her, letting her cry against his shoulder while his own tears fell silently. They sat like that for nearly 20 minutes, two people connected by blood, neither acknowledged, sharing grief and comfort in the strange intimacy of strangers who somehow understood each other completely. When Margaret finally composed herself, she apologized repeatedly for breaking down, for sharing such personal information with someone she barely knew. But Marcus insisted she had nothing to apologize for, that he was honored she trusted him with her story. As the evening wound down and Marcus prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door and hugged him again, this embrace lasting even longer than the first. "Thank you for listening without judgment," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me as a person, not as a mistake I made when I was young and scared. You have an old soul, Mike. You remind me of how I imagined my son might have turned out if he'd been raised by good people." The irony of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was her son. He had been raised by good people, and he was standing right in front of her, playing a role, living a lie that was becoming more painful with every passing moment. He drove back to his motel in a daze, barely seeing the road, his mind replaying every word, every gesture, every tear. That night Marcus made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He had to tell her the truth, but he couldn't do it as Mike the garbage collector. He needed to come clean about everything, his real identity, his wealth, his elaborate investigation, his reasons for disguising himself. But more than that, he needed to prove beyond any doubt that he was her son before revealing himself, because making that claim without certainty could devastate her all over again. He called his private investigator at midnight and ordered a rush DNA test, arranging for the investigator to collect samples from the coffee mug Margaret had given him that evening, which Marcus had carefully preserved in a plastic bag. He also provided his own DNA sample through an overnight courier. The lab promised results in 72 hours with the expedited processing, 3 days. In 3 days, Marcus would know for absolute certain whether Margaret Patterson was his biological mother. And then he'd have to decide how to tell her that the kind garbage collector she'd befriended was actually her son, now worth billions, who'd gone to extraordinary lengths to find her. The thought of her reaction terrified him more than any business negotiation ever had. Would she feel betrayed, manipulated? Or would she understand that he'd simply been too afraid of rejection to approach her directly? The next 3 days were the longest of Marcus's life. He continued his garbage collection route, maintained his interactions with Margaret, all while carrying the secret that grew heavier with each passing hour. She invited him for coffee on Thursday, and they sat on her porch talking about neighborhood changes and shared memories of feeling invisible in a world too busy to notice. On Friday, she mentioned her broken porch step, and Marcus immediately offered to fix it that weekend, knowing full well the DNA results would arrive before then and potentially change everything. But Margaret accepted gratefully, saying she'd make lunch for him while he worked. The normalcy of planning future moments together while sitting on the precipice of revelation felt surreal. Marcus found himself memorizing everything about these interactions, the way Margaret laughed, the expressions that crossed her face, the gestures she made when talking. He was terrified that once the truth came out, these simple, genuine moments would disappear, replaced by the complicated dynamics of mother-son reunion and the inescapable presence of his wealth that would fundamentally alter their relationship. On Friday evening, Margaret mentioned casually that she'd been thinking about her son more than usual lately. "Talking to you has helped me process old grief I'd buried," she said. "I think maybe he'd be around your age now, if he's alive. I hope he's found peace. I hope he's happy." Saturday morning arrived with an email from the private investigator. DNA results confirmed with 99.9% certainty. Margaret Patterson was his biological mother. Marcus stared at the screen for 10 minutes, reading the clinical language that confirmed what his heart had already known. Years of searching, millions spent on investigations, dead ends and false leads, and ultimately he'd found her by accident while disguised as someone else entirely. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. He had the porch repair supplies in his car, had planned to spend the day fixing Margaret's step and enjoying her company one more time before revealing everything. But now, with confirmation in hand, the charade felt impossible to maintain. Every moment he spent with her while she remained ignorant of his true identity felt like a betrayal, yet the thought of walking up to her door and explaining everything made his chest tighten with anxiety. He'd practiced speeches in the mirror all week, rehearsed different approaches, but none of them felt right. How do you tell someone that their long-lost son has been collecting their garbage for 3 weeks? How do you explain wealth beyond imagination to someone struggling to pay medical bills? How do you bridge a gap of 37 years in a single conversation without breaking something precious and fragile? Despite his anxiety, Marcus drove to Maple Street at the agreed time, tools in hand, prepared to fix the porch while figuring out how to reveal the truth. But when Margaret opened the door, she immediately knew something was wrong. Women who've carried grief for decades develop intuition about emotional weather, can read storms in faces others keep carefully neutral. "What's wrong, Mike?" she asked, concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus stood on her doorstep, tool bag hanging from suddenly weak fingers, and made a split-second decision. He couldn't keep lying, couldn't spend another moment in her presence pretending to be someone he wasn't. The words came out in a rush, unpolished and desperate. "My real name isn't Mike. I'm not really a garbage collector, and I have something to tell you that's going to sound crazy, but I need you to hear me out before you react." Margaret's face shifted through confusion, fear, and defensive suspicion. She stepped back, hand on the door, ready to slam it shut if this stranger she'd trusted turned out to be dangerous. But something in Marcus's expression, desperation mixed with profound emotion, made her pause. "Who are you?" she asked, voice shaking. Marcus took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "My name is Marcus Chen. I was born 37 years ago and left at a fire station wrapped in a blue blanket. And I believe, I know, that you're my mother." The color drained from Margaret's face so completely that Marcus feared she might faint. She gripped the doorframe for support, mouth opening and closing without sound, eyes wide with shock that bordered on disbelief. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, seconds feeling like hours as his words settled into her consciousness and began rearranging her entire understanding of the past 3 weeks. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What did you just say?" Marcus repeated it, slower this time, pulling out his phone to show her the DNA test results, the adoption records he'd finally gained access to through legal channels, the photograph of young Margaret that matched the one she'd shown him from her album. She stared at the evidence with trembling hands, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow as the impossible became real before her eyes. Then she looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time, seeing past the aging makeup and shabby clothes to the features she'd memorized in 10 precious minutes 37 years ago. Her hand reached out slowly, tentatively, touching his face like she was afraid he might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Marcus?" she whispered, testing the name. My baby's name is Marcus. And then she did faint, her legs giving out completely, leaving Marcus to catch her before she hit the ground, cradling his mother for the first time since he was a newborn infant. Marcus carried Margaret inside and laid her gently on the couch, panic flooding through him as he grabbed a glass of water and patted her face gently, calling her name. She came to within 30 seconds, her eyes fluttering open with confusion before reality crashed back, and she gasped, sitting up so quickly she nearly knocked the water from his hands. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of 37 years hanging in the air between them like something physical and alive. Margaret's hand reached out again, touching his face, his hair, his shoulders, as if confirming through touch that he was real and not some grief-induced hallucination. "You came back," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word. "You came back to me. I spent 37 years praying you were alive and happy, and you came back." Tears poured down her face in rivers, and Marcus felt his own control crumbling. He'd planned this moment, rehearsed it, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of his mother's hands on his face, her eyes searching his features for the baby she'd held so briefly. All the questions he'd wanted to ask, all the explanations he'd prepared, evaporated. Instead, he simply said, "I never stopped looking for you." The next hour was a blur of tears, explanations and revelations that tumbled over each other in chaotic order. Margaret wanted to know everything: where he'd grown up, who had raised him, whether they'd been good to him. Marcus told her about his adoptive parents, Tom and Linda Chen, who'd given him a loving home and every opportunity. He showed her photos on his phone, and Margaret wept, seeing the images of the couple who'd loved her son when she couldn't. She thanked them through tears, even though they'd been gone 5 years, thanked them for giving Marcus the life she'd dreamed of for him. Then came the harder part, explaining who he really was, the wealth he'd accumulated, the company he'd built. Marcus pulled up articles about himself, Forbes profiles, business features, and watched Margaret's face shift from shock to disbelief, to something approaching overwhelm. "You're one of those billionaires I see on TV?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "You're famous and important, and you spent 3 weeks collecting my garbage." Marcus nodded, then explained his reasoning, how direct approach might have scared her, how he'd needed to know who she was before revealing himself, how he'd wanted to understand her without the complication of wealth distorting everything. Margaret listened, processing, her emotions clearly at war between joy at finding her son and shock at everything he'd become. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Margaret finally asked, the question Marcus had been dreading. "Why the disguise and deception? I would have welcomed you immediately if you'd just knocked on my door and told me the truth." Marcus struggled to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. How could he explain that fear of rejection had driven a 42-year-old billionaire to dress as a garbage collector? How could he make her understand that money had taught him to distrust everyone's motives, that he'd needed to see who she was when she thought he was nobody? "I was afraid," he admitted finally, the honesty feeling like stripping off armor he'd worn so long it felt like skin. "Afraid you wouldn't want to know me. Afraid you'd see dollar signs instead of your son. Afraid that if you rejected me, I'd have to live the rest of my life with that wound. So I became invisible to get close to you safely, to understand who you were before risking everything." Margaret absorbed this, her expression softening from confusion to understanding. She reached for his hand, holding it between both of hers, and spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd lived with regret for decades. "I understand fear. Fear made me give you away. Fear kept me from trying to find you. Fear has ruled too much of both our lives. Maybe it's time we stopped being afraid." They talked until the sun set and darkness filled the small living room, neither bothering to turn on lights as they sat in the comfortable shadows, sharing decades of stories in compressed hours. Marcus told her about building his company, the loneliness of success, the way wealth had isolated him from genuine human connection. Margaret told him about her marriage to David, how she'd confessed her secret on their wedding night, and he'd loved her anyway, how they'd tried desperately to have children, but couldn't. She explained the medical debt from David's cancer treatment, the jobs she'd worked to pay it off, the quiet dignity of a life lived simply when circumstances offered no other option. As they talked, Marcus noticed something shifting in her demeanor. She kept glancing around her shabby living room, as if seeing it through new eyes, suddenly self-conscious about the worn furniture and peeling paint. He recognized the look. Shame at poverty when confronted with extreme wealth. It was exactly what he'd feared, the dynamic that wealth created, the invisible barrier that money built between people. "Please don't," he said gently, knowing what she was thinking. "Don't look at your home differently because of my money. This house has more warmth and love than my penthouse ever has. You have nothing to be ashamed of." But Margaret shook her head, tears forming again. "How can I not feel ashamed? You've become this incredible success, this powerful man who could buy anything in the world. And here I am in my run-down house, barely able to pay the electric bill. You deserved so much more than what I could have given you. The people who raised you gave you opportunities I never could have provided. I made the right choice giving you up, but seeing the proof of that, seeing how much better your life turned out without me, it hurts in ways I didn't expect." Marcus felt something break inside his chest at her words. He moved closer, taking both her hands in his, making her look at him directly. "You didn't give me up so I could become rich," he said intensely. "You gave me up so I could be loved. And I was. Tom and Linda loved me completely, gave me a happy childhood, supported every dream I had, but they couldn't fill the hole of not knowing you, couldn't answer questions about where I came from or why I was given away. Money can't fix that emptiness. Success can't cure that wound. I would trade every dollar I have for what I've found in the past 3 weeks. A mother who sees me, really sees me, not my bank account or my accomplishments. Just me as a human being worthy of kindness and coffee and home-cooked meals." Something in Marcus's words seemed to reach Margaret through her shame and grief. She squeezed his hands and nodded slowly, accepting the truth that wealth didn't automatically erase wounds or replace human connection. Then she asked the question Marcus had been both hoping for and dreading. "What happens now? Where do we go from here?" It was the question he'd been asking himself for 3 weeks, and he still didn't have a perfect answer. But he'd learned something important during his time as Mike the garbage collector, that the best relationships weren't built on grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but on small, consistent acts of showing up and being present. "I'd like to be part of your life, if you'll let me," Marcus said carefully. "Not as Marcus Chen, the billionaire trying to rescue you or fix your problems. Not as some philanthropic project or obligation, but as your son, building a relationship one day at a time, learning who we are to each other beyond biology and circumstances. I know I lied about my identity, and I know that broke trust, so I understand if you need time to forgive me or process all this. But I'm not going anywhere. I've spent 37 years looking for you, and now that I've found you, I'm not losing you again." Margaret pulled him into an embrace so tight it squeezed the air from his lungs, holding him like she'd held that newborn baby for 10 precious minutes before saying goodbye forever. "I don't need time to forgive you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I need time to believe this is real, that God or fate or whatever force governs the universe brought my son back to me in the form of a kind garbage collector who saw me when nobody else did. I need time to adjust to the fact that my baby grew up to be this accomplished, generous, lonely man who went to insane lengths just to know his mother. But forgiveness? You have nothing to be forgiven for. You came looking for me when you could have lived your entire life without knowing the woman who gave you away. That takes courage. I can barely comprehend." They held each other as darkness deepened outside. Two people who'd spent decades incomplete, finally becoming whole. In the morning, there would be complicated conversations about what their relationship would look like going forward, about how to navigate the vast gulf between their different worlds. But for tonight, for this moment, they were simply what they'd always been meant to be, mother and son, reunited against impossible odds, bound by love that had survived 37 years of separation and found its way home despite every obstacle. Marcus woke up on Margaret's couch at dawn, disoriented for a moment before remembering everything that had happened. His mother, he could finally use that word without asterisks or qualifications, was asleep in her bedroom down the hall. He'd insisted on staying the night, afraid to leave her alone after such an emotional revelation, worried she might wake up and think it had all been a dream. As sunrise painted the living room in soft gold, Marcus looked around at the space with new eyes. This was his mother's home, the place where she'd lived her quiet life of grief and dignity for 40 years. Every worn piece of furniture, every faded photograph, every carefully mended curtain told a story of survival and resilience. His billionaire instincts immediately catalogued everything that needed fixing or replacing, but he forced himself to pause. Margaret had been right to worry about shame and the power dynamic his wealth would create. If he swooped in immediately throwing money at every problem, he'd be establishing himself as rescuer rather than son, benefactor rather than family. That wasn't the relationship he wanted. He needed to navigate this carefully, respecting her autonomy and dignity, while also not ignoring needs he now had the power to address. Margaret emerged from her bedroom at 7 wearing a bathrobe, her eyes swollen from crying, but also bright with something Marcus recognized as hope. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him, as if confirming he was still there, that last night hadn't been an elaborate dream conjured by loneliness and longing. They stared at each other for a long moment, then simultaneously smiled, tentative, uncertain smiles that acknowledged the strangeness of their situation. "I'll make coffee," Margaret said, moving toward the kitchen with purpose, clearly needing something normal to do with her hands. Marcus followed, watching as she went through the familiar routine, and they settled at the kitchen table with steaming mugs, just like they had as Mike and Margaret. Except now the pretense was gone, and reality sat between them, heavy and complicated. "I've been thinking," Margaret began carefully, "about what you said last night, about building a relationship slowly. I appreciate that, but I also need you to understand something important. I'm grateful for who you've become and what you've achieved, but your money scares me, not the money itself, but what it represents. A gap between us so vast I don't know how to bridge it. I don't want you to feel obligated to take care of me financially just because we share DNA." Marcus had expected this conversation and had spent half the night rehearsing his response. "I understand that fear," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And I want to be honest with you about my intentions. Yes, I want to help you. Yes, seeing you struggle with medical debt and a house that needs repairs bothers me when I have resources to fix those problems easily, but not because I pity you or feel obligated, because you're my mother, and helping family is what you do when you're able. If our situations were reversed, if you had wealth and I was struggling, wouldn't you want to help me?" Margaret nodded slowly, acknowledging the logic. "But," Marcus continued, "I also understand that accepting help can feel like losing independence or admitting failure, and I don't want to steamroll over your dignity. So here's what I propose. We spend the next few weeks just getting to know each other without money being part of the equation. I won't offer to pay off your debt or renovate your house or shower you with gifts. We'll just be Marcus and Margaret, mother and son, learning how to be family. And after we've established trust and understanding, we can revisit conversations about practical matters. Does that feel acceptable?" Relief washed over Margaret's face so visibly that Marcus knew he'd made the right choice. "Yes," she said. "That feels right. I need time to know you as a person, not as this famous, successful stranger who happens to be my biological son. I need to understand who you are beyond the Forbes articles and business achievements. And maybe you need the same thing, to know me as more than the woman who gave you up, to understand my life and choices without the complication of your wealth changing everything." They talked for another hour, establishing boundaries and expectations, agreeing to spend time together regularly without pressure or performance. Marcus explained he'd need to return to work, that he'd been absent from his company for 3 weeks and couldn't extend the charade much longer. But he promised to visit every weekend, to have regular dinners, to build their relationship with the same consistency he'd shown up at her curb every morning as Mike. Margaret accepted this, understanding that Marcus had responsibilities and a life beyond their reunion. As they talked, something else became clear. They genuinely liked each other. Beyond biology, beyond circumstances, they'd connected as humans during those 3 weeks of deception, and that foundation would serve them well as they navigated the complicated path ahead. Before leaving that morning, Marcus did something important. He removed the aging makeup completely, for the first time in Margaret's presence, showing her his real face without the artificial wrinkles and weathered skin. She watched the transformation with fascination and emotion, seeing her son's true appearance emerge from the disguise. "You're handsome," she said softly, reaching up to touch his now smooth cheek. "You have your father's eyes. Not David, your biological father. A man I dated briefly when I was young and foolish. He left when I told him I was pregnant, and I never saw him again. But you have his eyes, deep brown with gold flecks when the light hits them right." It was the first time she'd mentioned Marcus's biological father, and he filed the information away for future conversations. There was still so much to learn, so many pieces of his origin story yet to be revealed. But they had time now. For the first time in 37 years, they had all the time in the world. As Marcus prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door and hugged him one more time. "Come back soon," she whispered. "I've missed 37 years of your life, and I don't want to miss another day." Marcus promised he would, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Returning to his real life felt surreal after 3 weeks living as someone else. Marcus's assistant nearly cried with relief when he walked into the office Monday morning, clean-shaven and wearing a tailored suit instead of the garbage collector disguise he'd maintained for so long. The board had questions, investors demanded meetings, and his company had accumulated a mountain of decisions requiring his attention. But Marcus found himself changed in fundamental ways that made the corporate world feel smaller and less important than it had before. He'd spent 3 weeks experiencing life from the bottom of the economic ladder, seeing how invisible people became when society decided they didn't matter. He'd connected with his mother not through wealth or status, but through simple human kindness and genuine presence. Those experiences had cracked open something in his worldview that couldn't be sealed shut again. During his first board meeting, when executives argued about quarterly profits and market share, Marcus found himself thinking about Margaret's worn furniture and unpaid medical bills, about Tony and the other garbage collectors working brutal hours for wages that barely covered rent. The contrast between these worlds felt obscene, and for the first time, Marcus began seriously considering how he could use his wealth and influence to bridge gaps, instead of just accumulating more zeros in his bank account. That weekend, Marcus returned to Maple Street as promised, but this time he pulled up in his regular car, a modest luxury sedan rather than his usual Ferrari or the beat-up vehicle he'd used during the disguise. Margaret watched from her porch as he parked, and Marcus saw uncertainty flicker across her face as she registered the expensive car and remembered again who her son really was. But when he got out and walked toward her, just Marcus in jeans and a casual shirt, her smile returned. They spent the afternoon doing mundane things, fixing her porch step together, planting flowers in her garden, cooking dinner side by side in her small kitchen. Margaret told stories about her life with David, about working at the diner where they'd met, about small joys and ordinary struggles that made up a life. Marcus listened, really listened, storing away every detail like treasures. He told her about Tom and Linda, about growing up in a comfortable middle-class home before his tech company exploded beyond anyone's expectations. He showed her photos from his childhood, and Margaret wept, seeing the birthday parties and school plays she'd missed, but also smiled, knowing he'd been happy and loved. As evening fell, and they sat on the newly repaired porch drinking iced tea, Margaret said something that captured everything perfectly. "You know what's strange? For 3 weeks, I knew Mike the garbage collector. Now I'm getting to know Marcus the billionaire. And somehow they're the same person. And that person is my son. It's the most confusing, wonderful thing I've ever experienced." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Margaret fell into a comfortable rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Every Saturday, Marcus would arrive at Maple Street and they'd spend the day together doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary because they were doing them as family. They went to farmers' markets where Margaret taught him how to pick the best produce, visited the diner where she'd worked decades ago and met old co-workers who remembered her fondly, took walks through the neighborhood while she pointed out landmarks from her past. Marcus cherished these simple moments more than any business triumph he'd ever achieved. But cracks began appearing in their carefully constructed normalcy. Neighbors started noticing the expensive car that showed up every Saturday, started asking Margaret questions about her mysterious visitor. She deflected at first, saying he was a friend. But small communities thrive on gossip, and speculation grew wilder with each passing week. Then one morning, a local newspaper ran a small story about billionaire Marcus Chen being spotted repeatedly in the modest Maple Street neighborhood, speculating about potential real estate investments or philanthropic projects. The article included a photo of Marcus leaving Margaret's house, and suddenly their private reunion became potential public spectacle. Margaret called Marcus in a panic after the article appeared, her voice shaking with anxiety about reporters possibly showing up at her door asking questions. Marcus immediately drove to her house, arriving to find 3 journalists already camped on her lawn with cameras and microphones. He'd dealt with media attention his entire career, but this felt different, more invasive, more personal, threatening to destroy the fragile privacy they'd carefully protected. Marcus pulled into her driveway and got out of his car, immediately surrounded by reporters shouting questions. "Mr. Chen, are you investing in this neighborhood? Is this woman a romantic interest? What brings a billionaire to Maple Street?" Marcus held up his hand for silence, his CEO voice cutting through the chaos with authority. "I'm visiting my mother," he said simply, the words landing like a bomb in the crowd. Cameras flashed frantically as reporters scrambled to process this revelation, shouting follow-up questions about how they'd met, why the reunion was happening now, whether this was a publicity stunt. Marcus ignored them all, walking to Margaret's door, where she stood trembling and overwhelmed. He put his arm around her shoulders and guided her inside, shutting the door firmly on the media circus erupting on her front lawn. Inside, Margaret collapsed onto her couch, hyperventilating as the reality of Marcus's fame crashed into her quiet life like a tidal wave. "I can't do this," she gasped between breaths. "I can't be on TV and in newspapers. I can't have people digging into my past, judging me for giving you up, turning our private story into entertainment. This is too much, Marcus. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Marcus knelt in front of her, taking her hands and talking her through breathing exercises until her panic subsided. He felt crushing guilt for not anticipating this, for being naive enough to think they could maintain anonymity in an age where everyone carried cameras and nothing stayed private for long. "I'm so sorry," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I should have been more careful. Should have thought about how my visibility would impact you. This is my fault." But Margaret shook her head, wiping her eyes. "It's not your fault for being successful. It's not your fault that the world is interested in your life. I'm not equipped for this level of attention. I'm a private person who's lived a quiet life. I don't know how to be someone's mother in front of the whole world." They spent hours discussing options, trying to figure out how to protect their relationship from media exploitation, while also not hiding or being ashamed of their reunion. Marcus suggested issuing a simple press statement, confirming he'd found his birth mother and asking for privacy, hoping that would satisfy public curiosity without providing sensational details. Margaret agreed, and Marcus's publicist crafted a brief, dignified statement that went out that evening. "Marcus Chen has recently reunited with his biological mother after a lifelong search. This is a deeply personal matter, and he requests privacy for both himself and his mother as they build their relationship. No further comments will be made at this time." The statement did little to stop speculation, but it established boundaries and gave them legal standing to pursue harassment charges if media crossed lines. More importantly, it publicly acknowledged their relationship, removing the burden of secrecy they'd been carrying. Over the next few days, the story gained traction online and in tabloids, with people digging up every detail they could find about Margaret's life, speculating about the circumstances of Marcus's adoption, creating narratives that had nothing to do with reality. Marcus watched helplessly as his mother's privacy evaporated, as strangers online debated whether she'd been right to give him up, or criticized her for not trying harder to keep him. The public scrutiny took a toll on Margaret that Marcus hadn't fully anticipated. She stopped answering her phone because reporters kept calling. She stopped going to her usual grocery store because people stared and whispered. She felt imprisoned in her own home by the attention Marcus's presence had brought into her life. During their next Saturday visit, she looked exhausted and smaller somehow, diminished by stress in ways that broke Marcus's heart. "Maybe we should take a break," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "Maybe if you stop visiting for a while, people will lose interest and move on to the next story. I don't want to lose you again, but I can't live like this, feeling like I'm being watched and judged every moment." Marcus felt panic rise in his chest at the thought of losing her again, but he forced himself to really hear what she was saying. This wasn't about her not wanting him. It was about her being overwhelmed by circumstances neither of them had fully controlled. He took her hand gently. "Or," he said slowly, an idea forming, "you could come stay with me for a while. My building has security, privacy, protection from media. You could hide from the circus until it dies down, which it will eventually. Some celebrity will do something scandalous, and everyone will forget about us." Margaret looked at him with surprise and uncertainty, clearly torn between wanting escape and fearing what accepting his help would mean. "I can't just leave my home and move into your penthouse like some kind of, I don't even know what," she protested. "That's not a relationship between equals. That's me becoming dependent on your charity." Marcus understood her resistance, but pushed back gently. "It's not charity. It's family taking care of family during a crisis I inadvertently created. You wouldn't be living there permanently, just temporarily, until the media attention calms down, and it would give us time together away from prying eyes, time to really know each other without performing for cameras or worrying about reporters. Please, let me do this. Let me protect you from a situation I caused." The desperation in his voice, must have reached her, because after a long moment, Margaret nodded. "Just for a few weeks," she said firmly, "until things calm down. And I'm paying you rent." Marcus started to protest, but she cut him off. "Non-negotiable. If I'm staying in your home, I'm contributing something, even if it's a token amount. I need that dignity, Marcus. Please understand." He did understand, so he agreed to accept a nominal rent that would let her maintain her sense of independence, while also giving her the protection she desperately needed. Moving Margaret to his penthouse felt like crossing a threshold into a new phase of their relationship. As Marcus helped her pack a suitcase with enough clothes and personal items for an extended stay, he watched her move through her modest home, touching things with the tenderness people reserve for treasured possessions they're leaving behind. She brought the photo album with pictures from when she was pregnant, a quilt her grandmother had made, a handful of items that represented her life with David. Everything fit into 2 small suitcases, the entirety of what she needed to survive temporarily away from home. When they arrived at Marcus's building and the doorman greeted him by name with practiced deference, Margaret went very quiet, her eyes widening as they rode the private elevator to the penthouse level. Marcus watched anxiety build in her posture and tried to prepare her for the shock of his actual living space. But nothing could really prepare someone who lived in a 40-year-old house with worn furniture for the reality of a penthouse that cost $30 million and looked like something from an architecture magazine. When the elevator doors opened directly into his home, Margaret froze, staring at floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, at art that cost more than most houses, at space designed for entertaining hundreds rather than living. She turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Who are you? Really? Because I thought I knew, but this is overwhelming." Marcus set Margaret's suitcases down and moved to stand beside her, seeing his home through her eyes for the first time. What he'd grown accustomed to, the luxury, the excess, the sheer scale of wealth on display, must look obscene to someone who'd spent decades pinching pennies and paying off medical debt dollar by dollar. "I'm still me," he said softly, answering her question with the only truth that mattered. "The guy who fixed your porch step and drank your coffee and listened to your stories. This place, the money, the success, it's what I've done, not who I am." Mike the garbage collector wasn't entirely fake. That was me without the armor, me stripped down to basics. This, he gestured at the penthouse, this is just the costume I wear for the business world, the same way I wore a disguise to meet you. Neither version is more real than the other. Margaret absorbed his words, turning slowly to take in the space again with new understanding. Marcus showed her to the guest suite, which was larger than her entire house and decorated with hotel-like perfection that had never felt lived in. "Make yourself at home," he said, though they both recognized the impossibility of that instruction. How could anyone feel at home in a museum? As if reading his thoughts, Margaret smiled sadly and said, "This is going to take some adjustment." The first few days were awkward in ways neither had anticipated. Margaret felt like a visitor in a space too perfect to touch, afraid to use the expensive coffee maker or sit on furniture that probably cost more than her car. Marcus tried to make her comfortable, but his own discomfort with having someone in his private space, something he'd never allowed before, created tension neither knew how to address. They circled each other politely like house guests rather than family, both trying too hard to be considerate and ending up being distant instead. The breaking point came on the 3rd evening, when Marcus came home from work to find Margaret eating dinner alone in the guest room rather than the dining area. "What are you doing?" he asked, confused and a little hurt. Margaret looked embarrassed, gesturing at her simple meal of soup and bread. "I didn't want to make a mess in your perfect kitchen, and eating at that giant dining table alone felt ridiculous. I'm more comfortable in here." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Frustration mixed with understanding, mixed with sadness, at how thoroughly wealth had complicated something that should have been simple. "This isn't working," he said, and Margaret's face fell until he continued quickly. "Not us, this formal arrangement. We're both trying so hard to maintain boundaries that we've forgotten we're supposed to be family." That conversation led to a renegotiation of their living arrangement. Margaret admitted she felt like a museum exhibit in the penthouse, uncomfortable touching anything or making her presence known. Marcus confessed that he'd lived alone so long he'd forgotten how to share space with another person, that he'd been treating her like a guest instead of his mother. They agreed to some changes. Margaret would take over the kitchen and cook meals they'd eat together at the breakfast bar instead of the formal dining table. Marcus would work from home more often so she wasn't alone all day in an unfamiliar space, and they'd establish routines that felt more like family than like a billionaire hosting a charity case. The shift was subtle but profound. Within a week, the penthouse began feeling less like a showroom and more like a home. Margaret's touches appeared. Flowers she'd bought at the market arranged in vases, the quilt from her house draped over the guest bed, her modest toiletries lined up in the bathroom. Marcus found himself looking forward to coming home, knowing Margaret would be there with dinner cooking and stories to share about her day. For the first time since his adoptive parents died, his home felt lived in rather than merely occupied. The loneliness that had haunted him for years began lifting, replaced by the simple comfort of family presence. But living together also meant confronting differences that couldn't be ignored or glossed over with polite conversation. Margaret was frugal in ways Marcus had forgotten existed. She turned off lights in empty rooms, reused tea bags, saved leftovers Marcus would have thrown away. She was horrified by his casual spending, the way he'd order $50 worth of takeout without thinking or replace perfectly good items because newer versions existed. Their first real argument happened over groceries. Margaret had walked to a discount store 40 minutes away to save money rather than using the premium delivery service Marcus's chef normally employed. "You could have used the service," Marcus said, frustrated that she'd exhausted herself to save $20. "You don't need to walk miles to save money when I have accounts set up." Margaret's response was sharp. "I need to contribute somehow, and if that means saving money on groceries, then that's what I'll do. I won't be completely dependent on you for everything. I'm not a pet or a burden. I'm a grown woman who's taken care of herself for 64 years. And I won't stop now just because you have more money than sense." The accusation stung, but Marcus recognized the fear beneath her anger. She was terrified of losing her independence, of being swallowed by his wealth, and becoming someone she didn't recognize. That night, they had their most honest conversation yet. Marcus explained that money stopped meaning anything to him years ago when he had more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, that watching her struggle with things he could easily fix frustrated him, not because he pitied her, but because he loved her and wanted her comfortable. Margaret explained that her dignity was tied to self-sufficiency, that accepting too much help felt like admitting she couldn't manage her own life, that the gap between their financial situations made her feel inadequate in ways she couldn't articulate. They didn't solve everything that night, but they reached an understanding. Marcus would consult her before making financial decisions that affected her, and Margaret would try to accept help when it was offered out of love rather than obligation. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. They were learning to be family, despite circumstances that made every interaction complicated by the weight of wealth. Neither could forget, even when they tried. As weeks passed and media attention gradually faded to occasional mentions in tabloids, Marcus and Margaret settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. They developed rituals: Saturday morning farmers' market trips, Sunday evening movie nights, weekday dinners where they'd talk about their days like any parent and adult child living together. Marcus began involving Margaret in parts of his business life, bringing her to casual work dinners and introducing her to his team. She was nervous at first, convinced she'd embarrass him with her lack of education or understanding of his world. But Marcus watched with pride as his colleagues responded to Margaret's warmth and authenticity, how she asked genuine questions and listened with real interest. She had a gift for seeing past professional facades to the humans underneath, and more than once, Marcus heard employees tell her things they'd never shared with him. Struggles with work-life balance, family problems, career doubts. His mother had a way of making people feel seen that reminded him of their first encounters when he'd been Mike the garbage collector. She gave others what she'd longed for herself: recognition, attention, validation that they mattered. Watching her interact with his world made Marcus see his company differently, made him more aware of the humans behind productivity metrics and quarterly reports. One evening, about 2 months after Margaret had moved in, she approached Marcus with a serious expression that immediately put him on alert. They'd been careful around each other, both afraid of pushing too hard or expecting too much, but something in her face said this conversation wouldn't be careful. "I need to talk to you about something important," she said, settling onto the couch and patting the space beside her. Marcus sat, bracing himself for whatever came next. "I'm ready to go home," Margaret said, and Marcus felt his heart drop before she continued. "Not because I'm unhappy here or don't want to see you, but because this, living in your penthouse, being absorbed into your world, it's not sustainable long-term. I have my own life, my own home, my own identity beyond being Marcus Chen's mother, and you need your space back too, even if you won't admit it. We've proven we can have a relationship. Now we need to figure out what that relationship looks like when we're not living on top of each other." Marcus wanted to protest, wanted to beg her to stay because coming home to an empty penthouse again felt unbearable. But he recognized the wisdom in her words and the courage it took to set this boundary. She was right. They'd been living in a bubble, hiding from reality. It was time to figure out how to be family in the real world, with all its complications and distances. The day Margaret moved back to Maple Street, Marcus insisted on helping, despite her protests that she could manage the 2 suitcases herself. As they drove through the city toward her neighborhood, Marcus felt emotions warring inside him: sadness at losing daily contact, pride that she was reclaiming her independence, fear that distance would erode what they'd built. But when they pulled up to her house, something was different. The exterior had been repainted in soft, welcoming colors. The porch no longer sagged. New gutters gleamed in the afternoon sun. Margaret gasped, turning to Marcus with accusation and wonder mixed in her expression. "What did you do?" Marcus held up his hands defensively. "Before you get angry, hear me out. While you were staying with me, your house was sitting empty and vulnerable. I had a contractor do essential repairs, structural things that needed addressing for safety and code compliance, not cosmetic upgrades. Nothing inside was touched. Your furniture, your belongings, everything is exactly as you left it. But the bones of the house needed help, and I knew you'd refuse if I asked permission, so I did it anyway, and I'm not apologizing." Margaret stared at the house, then back at Marcus, clearly torn between gratitude and frustration at his presumption. "You can't just make decisions about my property without asking," Margaret said, but her voice lacked real anger. Marcus stepped closer, taking her hand. "You're right, and I'm sorry for overstepping. But I also couldn't let you come home to a house with structural damage when I had the means to fix it. Not as charity, but as practicality. If our roles were reversed, if you could easily fix something that would keep me safe, wouldn't you do it even if I was too proud to ask?" Margaret sighed, squeezing his hand. "You're impossible, you know that, right? You don't fight fair using logic and love against stubborn pride." But she smiled as she said it, and Marcus knew he was forgiven. They went inside together, And Marcus watched as Margaret moved through her home, touching familiar objects, settling back into her space like breathing out after holding your breath too long. She belonged here in ways she'd never belonged in his penthouse, and Marcus understood that loving someone sometimes meant letting them live in their own world, even when you could offer them yours. Over the next hour, they unpacked her suitcases, and Marcus helped her reorganize things, both of them aware this was a transition moment, an ending and beginning simultaneously occurring. Before leaving, Marcus broached the subject they'd been dancing around for weeks. "I want to help with your medical debt," he said directly, no longer hiding behind careful language. "Not as charity or obligation, but because I can, and because carrying that burden serves no purpose except satisfying some arbitrary sense that you need to suffer for past choices. You don't. You've suffered enough. Please let me clear it so you can actually live instead of just surviving." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "On one condition. You let me pay you back, even if it takes 20 years at $50 a month. I don't care that the amount is meaningless to you. It matters to me that I'm not just accepting a handout, that I'm honoring the help by contributing what I can." Marcus wanted to argue that repayment was unnecessary, but he recognized this was important to her dignity and sense of self. "Deal," he agreed. $50 a month for as long as you want to pay, and when you decide you're done paying, that's fine too. This is about giving you freedom, not creating a new obligation. Margaret hugged him tightly, whispering thank you over and over, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest, the satisfaction of using wealth for something that actually mattered, that changed a life in tangible, meaningful ways. Over the following months, Marcus and Margaret developed a new rhythm built on regular contact without cohabitation. Marcus visited every Sunday for dinner, and Margaret came to his penthouse once a month for what they jokingly called fancy dinners, where Marcus would cook elaborate meals and they'd pretend to be sophisticated while laughing at his culinary failures. They talked on the phone every few days, sharing mundane details of their lives in ways that felt precious precisely because they were ordinary. But Marcus also implemented changes in his business that directly resulted from his time as Mike the garbage collector and his relationship with Margaret. He established a foundation focused on supporting service workers, sanitation employees, cleaners, food service staff, providing education grants, emergency funds, and healthcare assistance. He increased wages for everyone in his company, implemented profit-sharing programs, and began evaluating his business decisions through a lens of how they'd impact the people at the bottom of economic hierarchies. His board resisted at first, arguing that corporations existed to maximize shareholder value, not solve social problems. But Marcus held firm, using his controlling interest to push through changes that made his company a model for ethical capitalism. The foundation became his passion project, the thing he was proudest of beyond any technical innovation or business achievement. One Sunday evening, about 6 months after their reunion, Margaret asked Marcus to look at something in her attic. They climbed the narrow stairs together, and she led him to a cardboard box tucked in the corner, clearly untouched for decades. "I want you to have this," she said, opening it to reveal baby items carefully preserved. The blue blanket she'd wrapped him in, a tiny hospital bracelet with baby boy Sullivan written in faded ink, the note she'd written asking that he be given a better life. Marcus picked up the blanket with trembling hands, the physical evidence of his origin story made real in soft, worn fabric. "I kept these, even though it hurt to look at them," Margaret explained. "They were all I had of you, and I couldn't let them go, even when keeping them meant living with constant reminders of what I'd lost. But they belong to you now, your story, your history, the beginning of everything you became." Marcus held the items carefully, overcome with emotion at the tangible connection to his first moments of life. These objects had existed in parallel to his entire childhood, adolescence and adulthood, held by a mother he'd never known was grieving him while he was being loved by other parents who'd wanted him desperately. The complexity of adoption, of loss and gain, of multiple truths existing simultaneously, hit him fully for the first time. As they descended from the attic, Marcus carrying the box of baby items like precious cargo, he realized something profound. His 3 weeks as Mike the garbage collector had taught him that invisibility was both shield and curse, that wealth distorted every relationship, that dignity mattered more than comfort. His reunion with Margaret had healed wounds he'd carried his entire life, while also revealing that family was complicated, that love didn't erase practical challenges, that bridges between different worlds required constant maintenance. But most importantly, he'd learned that his wealth was only meaningful when used to create connection rather than isolation, when it served as a tool for helping rather than a wall for hiding. The foundation, the changes in his company, the relationship with Margaret, these were the things that would matter when his life was assessed, not the billions in his bank account or the accolades from business magazines. That evening, sitting at Margaret's kitchen table eating pot roast like they did every Sunday, Marcus looked at his mother and felt profound gratitude for everything that had happened. The adoption that gave him opportunities, the search that taught him humility, the disguise that revealed truth, and most of all, the woman across from him who'd loved him enough to let him go and welcomed him back without hesitation when he returned. A year after their reunion, on the anniversary of the day Marcus had first appeared at Margaret's house as Mike the garbage collector, they stood together on her porch, watching the actual garbage truck make its rounds on Maple Street. Tony was driving, same as always, and when he saw Marcus and Margaret waving from the porch, he stopped the truck and came over. Marcus had stayed in touch with his former co-workers, had invited Tony and the crew to dinner at nice restaurants where they'd traded stories and laughed about Marcus's terrible technique on his first days. Tony clapped Marcus on the shoulder and nodded at Margaret. "You two look happy," he said simply. "I'm glad the garbage man found what he was looking for." After Tony left, Margaret turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for searching for me, for not giving up, for going to crazy lengths to find me and for loving me despite everything." Marcus shook his head. "Thank you for giving me life, for making the hardest choice imaginable because you wanted better for me, for welcoming me back without resentment or conditions, for teaching me that love isn't about grand gestures or money, but about showing up consistently and seeing each other truly." They stood together on the porch, mother and son, no longer separated by time or distance or circumstances, just two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and chose every day to keep finding each other again. The garbage truck rumbled away down Maple Street, and Marcus smiled, remembering the man he'd pretended to be and recognizing that Mike's kindness hadn't been pretend at all. It had been the truest version of himself, finally visible to the person who'd needed to see it most.